want to talk to you about today is actually not me, but my father when he was just a little boy. See, him and his family used to go camping at the Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri. His family would go there for fishing all weekend since it's a pretty hot recreational spot, as well as occasional camping and barbecuing, and all that other stuff. My father tells me it was a pretty regular occurrence of him and his family going there, and he has a lot of fond memories growing up there. He tells me that's the lake that his father taught him how to fish, and when he was older, as a teenager, his dad first taught him about girls. He told me since he had gone there so much growing up that he never really experienced anything out of the ordinary, but there was a few times in which he would describe this tall, white-looking dog watching him. My dad recalls one time specifically when he was just 8 or 9, and he had gone off into the woods to go pee, and he had looked up, and a few trees away was this white, wolf-looking head looking at him. My father said he froze right where he was, but this thing just kept staring at him from behind the tree. My dad slowly zipped up and slowly backtracked. He had told his mom and dad about it several times, but neither of them really gave him much credit or attention for that matter. He told me that there would be other times where he'd be playing in the lake and would get a really ominous feeling, like something bad was about to happen, and it would make him want to go home. There would be times he would be sitting there not wanting to do anything because of just this overwhelming sensation that something really awful was going to happen. His parents could never understand why, and he tried to play it off like he wasn't feeling good, or that he was sick just to avoid questioning, since they gave him a hard time about it earlier. A couple years later, when he was either 11 or 12, he was looking through the woods for some sticks and kindling to start a fire with back at camp, when everything around him suddenly got dead quiet. He began feeling nervous and acting strange, and he wanted to get out of there quickly, so he dropped a small pile of wood that he had in fear that something would happen, and ran back to the camp, telling his dad that he wasn't able to find anything. He says a lot of the times things only really happen when he wanders off into the woods, whether it be wanting to explore, hike, use the bathroom, etc. But he had mentioned multiple times that even when he was out playing by the lake and with his family, the feeling of dread would still overtake him, but yet wouldn't seem to affect anybody else, and his parents never seemed to sense anything. He's told me that he's never smelt anything weird, or never really seen anything weird besides the white-looking wolf head behind the tree watching him as he went to the bathroom. Since he grew up around there, other friends he went to school with had also visited that same lake frequently, and had other similar eerie experiences, but nothing necessarily more earth-shattering than what he had already experienced. When I ask him about it now, since he's an older guy, he doesn't really have much to say about it other than weird freaky stuff does go on there, and he's not really sure or has an explanation for anything. He ended up going to college in a different state, and never really returned home to Missouri, so he hasn't really been back since to that specific lake. But he says that he's sure that stuff still goes on, as things had gone on and off the whole time he had grown up there. The last thing he shared with me about his experiences is that he thought this was really strange and it disturbed him. Him and his family went camping with the neighbors next door. The neighbors also had a dog, a Labrador. Well, during this camping trip, he believes it was a weekend camping trip, since they stayed the night several days, and the only times they ever stayed the night for several days was on the weekends. So, this family at night had let their dog out to go to the bathroom. They trusted their dog to come back, and she usually always did. But one night she wandered off into the woods to go use the bathroom, and she never came back. The neighbors in my family thought that was weird since they were the neighbors. We were pretty familiar with their Labrador. After about 30 minutes, we decided to go out looking, even though it was dusk and dark. But we couldn't get really far since we didn't really have flashlights at the time. But I remember my neighbors kept calling her name, and figured maybe she had just not sure. I honestly can't remember the reason why they blew it off and decided to wait till the following morning to go look for her. If it was my dog, I would be out there searching in the dark no matter what. But apparently, our neighbors weren't too terribly bothered by the fact that their dog wasn't quite responding to its name, and it had been well past 30 minutes at this point. Come the following morning, there's absolutely zero trace of the dog. They even both hike about a mile or so in the woods and can't find a thing. A little distraught and disheartened, they figure that maybe she had just ran away, or maybe some other family had gotten a hold of her and decided to take her home. There really wasn't much done about it, and I'm not really sure why. But again, being a kid, I wasn't fully aware of all of their emotions and maybe what they went through once they got back to the house. But I do find it weird that not only did the dog disappear, but that they weren't even bothered by it. Maybe they knew something. I'm not quite sure. He's also informed me that I guess there's been a few missing persons throughout the area in the last 10 or 20 years, or so I've been told. With the weird activity going on in the area, I'm not quite surprised. Usually, things like this and disappearances seem to go hand in hand, and it wouldn't surprise me if there was a dogman in the area that my father had ran into and experienced firsthand. It was very late at night, and I was in the process of driving home from a long East Coast road trip. I was currently in Idaho, and I couldn't tell you what road I was on at the time. This was back in 91 or 92, I think. It was right after Metallica's The Black album had just come out. I remember that because I was blasting it in my car the whole way. I had already had multiple cups of coffee, and was very easily and quickly losing my ability to stay awake at the wheel. I remember I pulled off to a side out of the road. Now, the road I was on was only a 2-lane highway, and it was a little bit more off-trail, so to speak. It was much more rural, I remember at the time, and there was a lot of dense forest around where I was. Anyway, as I was in the pullout, I decided I would get a few hours of shut-eye, so I turned off my car, pulled back my car seat, and lifted up my legs onto the steering wheel, and tried to sleep as best as I could. I'm sure many are wondering how I could have done this, but I'm a really small person. I'm only 5'2", so spreading out wasn't as hard as some of you might think it to be. Well, I remember I drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember, I kept hearing this tapping on the glass. It's like if you took dog claws and began tapping the glass slightly, in weird sporadic patterns that didn't make any sense. I was drifting in and out of sleep, since it was enough to kind of wake me up somewhat, but I wasn't opening my eyes because I wasn't quite sure what it was. This went on for a couple of moments, I would guess, and eventually I opened my eyes, and in my horror, I see this massive German Shepherd looking at me through the window. Except this German Shepherd was pitch black and had amber eyes staring intently down at me. This thing had been tapping on the glass and was apparently standing on 2 legs. I was screaming and just kept screaming as this thing just stared at me for a moment. I've never seen an animal look so intently at me, let alone look deep into my soul like this thing's eyes did. I thought it was just some dog at first, but I could tell it wasn't just a dog. It acted so different. The way this thing moved, the way it even breathed, the way it stared into me, told me that it was something unnatural. It also didn't help that this thing's face was pressed right up against the glass, watching me like a trapped rat, ready to pounce and eat its prey. After maybe no more than 10 seconds, this thing pulled its face away from my driver's side window and began to walk towards the back side of my vehicle. I had no idea what was going on, so in sheer panic, I fumbled my car keys, stuck it in the ignition, and turned the car on, and I put that thing in drive so fast and flew out of there, you couldn't even believe it. As I pulled away quickly, I didn't even bother looking in my rearview mirror, or even my side mirrors. I didn't want to risk my brake lights illuminating what I might see. But who knows? Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe there was just a loose black German Shepherd that had amber eyes that wanted in my car for whatever reason. Although this was much larger than an average German Shepherd, if I recall. I just remember the head being humongous, and with it pressed against my driver's side window like that, it was like it was drooling over me, like it wanted me. But at the same time, the way it stared at me, it's like it wanted to tell me telepathically its intent was to hurt me, and it wanted me to be scared, like it wanted me to know I was powerless and could do nothing to stop it if it wanted to kill me. The sheer terror this thing invoked in me was unheard of, and I've been around many dogs in my lifetime, and never once have I had any sort of feeling of dread or pure evil like this thing let out. I don't know why it didn't just rip me out of the car and kill me right then and there, because it easily could have. Even though my car door was locked, I'm sure if it was strong enough, it could have broke through the glass and make me disappear so nobody could find me or any trace of me. Why it chose to pull its face away and walk towards the back of my car? Well, I'm not quite sure, and I have no idea what its plans were, whether they were benign or malicious. I'm glad I pulled out of there fast enough not to find out. I don't know how many others have had similar experiences to the story I just told you, but I haven't really met anybody or talked to anybody really about this encounter, so I thought I would share it with you so you could share it with people and who might have had a similar story happen to them. Part of me likes to look back and try to convince myself I was just so sleepless I hallucinated it, or that I was on some bad trip from drugs or something, even though I wasn't even on drugs at the time of the encounter. Sometimes I think back and think that maybe it was just a deformed bear, or some angry dog, but I try to put all these pieces together and I can't just quite fit exactly what happened to me and what I experienced. The part that still gives me nightmares to this day was the tapping on the glass. It was such a light, gentle tapping, like it wanted me to wake up to it, like it wanted me to know, hey, I'm here, and I can get ya. You need to be scared. I feel like if it was trying to get into my car, it would have been clawing at my window, or trying hard to get in and break the window. But it didn't. It acted so calm, and it taunted me. I'll always hold that fear in me that it'll happen again. My granddaddy was bluff charged by some sort of upright walking canine back many years ago. See, my grandfather loved to go out into the Blue Ridge Mountains and just look for antlers and any sort of things he could find. He was an avid collector of knickknacks and such, and one of his favorite pastimes was going out into the wilderness and seeing what he could find. This man had just about everything you can think of, from obsidian arrowheads to fully intact skulls of bears. It's like there was nothing this man could not find. And he would go everywhere. He would crawl into tight crevices. He would spelunk down into caves to find stuff. He would climb up to the tops of trees to get stuff even. The man was crazy, but his adventures told so many stories, and he had found so many cool things. Among all the searching, though, he has had a few strange occurrences with animals that he cannot fully explain their existence. He tells me there were a couple times that he's pretty sure he ran into Bigfoot, and the most haunting time for me was when he told me that he was bluff charged by some strange upright canine. He told me that he had come upon a small stream in which he was filling up his canteen when he had heard rustling noise about 10 to 20 feet to his right. He looked, and out behind a tree stepped this really shaggy upright canine. My grandpappy told me that he immediately felt fear and went to draw his weapon, and that this animal seemed aggressive already and was watching him intently, especially his hand, since it was moving towards his weapon. He tells me he's not really sure if he stumbled upon this animal's territory or why it acted so aggressive, but he wasn't going to take any chances since he has had several close calls with moose and other large dangerous animal when he was younger. He went to draw his weapon, and this thing began charging at him. My grandfather threw down his canteen and bolted. He said he could tell right off the bat that it wasn't a full-on charge, and that it was a bluff charge, because he said he sensed that it wasn't moving near as fast as it could, but enough to drive out my grandfather out of the area like it intended to. Even though it did really spook him, he always reassured me when he recounted the story that he probably just stumbled upon some unknown animal's territory and had come too far into the zone and was maybe close to females. He recounts this animal as being about as tall as he was and pretty lean and lanky. He's also pretty cautious about where he travels in the Blue Ridge Mountains now, even though this took place 30-40 years ago. Okay, I'm sharing this story in hopes of someone else having another one, and I then will have this one out in the open. I was traveling Highway 10 from the west coast to the south coast of Florida. I was with my 6 kids and pulling a trailer with all of my belongings and 3 dogs in it. I was in a big SUV, and it was around 2 in the morning. The kids were asleep, and my 13-year-old daughter was in the passenger seat to make sure I stayed awake. So, after traveling Highway 10 for 3 days, I decided since we reached Florida, we would cut through the state just to save some time. So, we got off Highway 10 on an off-road in hopes of getting gas and making up some time. It was along Route 27. We came to the first little gas station. It was closed. I was nervous because we needed gas, so we continued on. I told my daughter to keep an eye out for deer crossing the 2-lane, deserted highway, because hitting a deer could kill us all and turn us over due to the trailer we were pulling. We were traveling around 45 miles an hour. I remember this so clearly, like it was yesterday. We had our brights on because the road was dark and winding. A few houses were on that highway, but not many. As we came around a corner and the headlights glowed, there was a lot of blood, fresh blood. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Where did all this blood come from? And on the side of the road was this 6 or 7 foot tall creature, if I had to estimate height. It was on its hind legs, hunched over a dead deer, eating it. It did not look up, not even when my headlights hit it. It was using its arms like a human, eating the deer. It had a very muscular body, pointed ears, and a long muzzle. If you ever saw a werewolf, this was it. It had a skinnier lower body, and much more lean than I would expect, but used its arms and hands just like a human would. If it looked up, though, I would have died. I looked over at my daughter, and we were both seeing the same thing at the same time. Tears came to my eyes instantly, and at the same time, we both freaked out and said, "Werewolf." I sped up because I was scared it would run and jump on the trailer and kill my dogs. As we got about a mile away, my heart was beating so hard. My daughter and I were so freaked out. It was a werewolf. I have never been a believer in werewolves. I don't watch any werewolf movies or have any reason to make this up. And as a matter of fact, until today, I have only told a handful of people about this. This is a werewolf in Florida. Not sure of the exact town or road, but I wish I did know, so I can find out if we were the only ones to have seen this thing. I will live my life wondering. It was between Alabama to Florida, along the Panhandle. I will never forget this night. My name is Angela. I am a 47-year-old female from Idaho Falls, Idaho. I grew up in Idaho, and I am an avid animal lover, especially wolves since I was very young. I am writing to tell you about my Dogman encounter when I was around 16 or 17 years old. It would have been around 1986 or 1987. Anyway, myself and my friend, who's a female, and my other friend, who's a male, decided one night to go into our local cemetery and look for what is called the Knocking Grave and the Werewolf Grave. walking grave and discovered that it is just a loose board which vibrates back when you knock on the grave. We never found the werewolf grave, so we just chalked it up to it being a myth. We decided to go back to the car and were talking when the male and female friend of mine decided they wanted some alone time, since they were a couple back then. I got out of the car and decided to walk around the cemetery by myself. It was a beautiful night with a full moon shining above. Ironic, I know. I was walking along, looking at the old gravestones and thinking how sad it was that so many people are completely forgotten after they die, when I heard a strange sound to my left. I was standing near a mausoleum, looking down into another part of the cemetery. I heard the sound again and started walking towards it. It sounded as though something was crunching on something. I stood there for a minute, listening. I immediately noticed how quiet it had gotten in the cemetery, and the hair stood up on my neck and arms. Usually, there is noise from cars, dogs barking, or crickets, or something like that, but there was nothing. I then saw a silhouette of something big and black standing a little ways away from me, around 25 feet to be exact. Something told me to back away slowly and leave now, but I ignored it. I crept closer to the creature, never taking my eyes off of it. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could see very well, especially with the moonlight helping light up the night. What I saw terrified me, and also piqued my curiosity. The creature first looked like a huge wolf, but the front legs and torso were abnormally large, and the back legs were huge. It had a long furry tail behind it, just like a wolf's tail. The head was huge, and it had long pointed ears, with tufts of fur at the tips from what I could see, and it was leaning down and was eating something. The sounds I had heard was the crunching it made when it bit into whatever it was eating. I was excited because I had always wanted to see a wild wolf, and I thought that's what I was looking at. I figured that maybe a wolf had escaped the zoo, which was right next door to the cemetery, and had caught a rabbit or something. I realized, though, that the zoo didn't have a wolf in it, and hadn't had one in years. That made me even more excited and curious. I stared at the creature for about a minute or so. Then I shifted my legs to get more comfortable, and I must have stepped on a twig or scuffled my feet, because the creature suddenly stopped eating, looked up and turned its head my way. It then stood up on its back legs, and I heard a loud pop, and that is when I realized that this was not a huge wolf. It was black and had a few brownish streaks in its fur. When it stood up, I saw its head, chest, stomach, and lower body. The shoulders and chest were massive and covered in fur that tapered down as you looked down towards the stomach and legs area. It reminded me of a bodybuilder on steroids because of how muscular it was. As it stood there, it started to sniff the air, and it stopped and stared my way. The eyes were a deep orange gold and seemed to glow in the moonlight. It looked at me, and I felt a fear grow deep within me that I had never felt before. I knew it saw me, and I knew I had made a huge mistake by not leaving when I first got that bad feeling. It felt as though everything went cold, and this creature could see within my soul. It stared at me for a minute, and then it opened its mouth, and it bared its teeth at me, as if it were smiling. The teeth were huge and yellowish white, and they looked very sharp, just right for ripping prey apart. It never took its eyes off me. It then lifted its arm and took one bite out of whatever it was eating. I then realized what I heard was it crunching bone and tearing flesh as it ate its meal. The hands were like elongated paws, and at the end of each finger were huge black claws that gripped the leg it was eating. I stood there watching it eat for what seemed like hours, when it could have only been a few minutes. He never took his eyes off me. The fear I felt overwhelmed me. I felt sick, and I was visibly shaking, and so I did the one thing I had been taught to never do when confronted with a predator. I turned and ran as fast as I could back to the car. I didn't care. I couldn't get his eyes out of at catching me and ripping me to shreds as I ran. I made it to the car, though, flung open the door, and jumped in screaming for my friends to start the car and get us out of here. They asked me what was wrong, and I just yelled at them to go now. They looked at me and saw the terrified look on my face, so the car was started and we left, and I never went back to that cemetery again. Later that night, I told both of my friends what I had seen, and they both laughed at me and told me it was just my mind playing tricks on me, which made me feel hurt and that they didn't believe me. But I could hardly believe myself. I saw a werewolf, or what is referred to as a dogman, and I will never forget it. On tonight's episode, we rejoin our Dogman encounters across the U.S. series, focusing on the East Coast this time. There's some hair-raising accounts and stories that are just as terrifying as the encounters that have happened on the West Side. Get ready, because the terror is not stopping anytime soon. Story 1. October 2000. It was later in the evening when I was driving back to my in-laws' house by myself and was going down a dirt road. I saw something in the ditch up ahead and on the right and didn't really know what it was until I got up far enough so that my headlights could catch it. I didn't know anything about Dogman until a couple of years ago. This thing had an outline of a huge dog, but when I got closer, it turned and looked at me. I just floored it. It didn't really bother me until I noticed it looking at me, and I saw that it was actually grasping what it was eating. I got back and didn't say exactly what I saw. I just asked them if they were any big dogs or wolves up where they lived. My father-in-law just laughed and said, no. Then he asked why. I didn't tell him anything, though. The thing I will never forget are those reddish-orange eyes that just kept staring at me, deep into my soul. Story 2. April 22nd, 2016. I had just arrived home, a few minutes after dusk, after visiting with my parents. Our location is pretty rural, but we do have a few neighbors within shouting distance of us. We have 33 acres of mixed forests and fields with lots of thick brush, consisting mostly of briars. I had my 2 young children with me, and the Jeep, ages 2 years and 11 months old, when I pulled in the driveway that night. My husband was working late, with an emergency case. It was near fully dark when I got home. As soon as I stepped out from my vehicle, I felt creeped out. It felt different outside. We have lots of peepers and crickets that would normally be making a lot of noise. Even the birds are usually chirping until an hour or more past dark. This time, there was not a sound. It was very warm that evening, so the peepers should have been in full chorus. Because of my uneasy feeling, I was rushing to get the kids in the house, and at the same time, did not want to leave RJ in the car alone for a minute as I routinely do. He and our older daughter, who was asleep, are normally too heavy for me to carry together at the same time. That night, though, I grabbed them both, one in each arm, after finding my keys to the front door, and carried them both. Usually, I would use the auto garage door. However, the opener did not work. When I reached the front door, at the top of the stairs and got situated on the front porch, I put down Angelina in order to open the front door. As soon as I turned my attention back to the front door, it happened. Somewhere to my left came a sound that will be forever seared into my memory. It started low and slowly increased to a moderately loud growl. It was deep-toned and very guttural, and was angry in character. It was nothing like anything I had ever heard before, but it did sound canine in origin, especially after spending an hour listening to various animal growls. The growl continued for approximately 10 seconds. I was so terrified, I was fumbling with the keys. It really felt like I was dropping into an 80s horror film. I really did think I was going to die. I was sure any second the thing making this sound was going to pounce upon me and the kids and eat us right then and there on the spot. The growl sounded as though the creature was standing just off to my left. I refused to look out of fear of what I would see. It sounded so close and/or even above eye level with me. My porch extends another 5 feet to the left, and then off the porch is the front of the house. There's 35 yards of grass to the edge of the tree line, and there's a field with 2-foot tall grass opposite of that. There's also a small shed between our porch and the tree line. Standing on the front porch from my head to the ground is approximately 9 feet, so I assume it was standing near the corner of the house. I had never been so afraid until a few moments later when it actually spoke to me. As the growl continued, it seemed to melt into audible words, spoken in a very deep and gruff tone that seemed to have a rough sort of reverberation quality to them. What I heard as clear as day was, "You can't get in." The only word that I'm sure of is the first "you," as the sound of the growl transitioned to English words and it sounded more like "yeesh." Now, I was finally hysterical and dropping the keys. Finally, I got the right one in and got the door open and got in. I had to kick my daughter through the door, regretfully. Strangely, she seemed oblivious to what had just transpired, as if she didn't hear it. I slammed the door shut and never looked. I didn't hear anything else that night. I called my husband and his friend to let them know what had happened. So I never did actually see what terrorized me, because I couldn't look. I've had 2 days to think about this encounter and talk with my husband, who has listened to just about every episode of Dogman Encounters with Vic Hundiff. I'm fairly certain that this was what was growling at me. The sound was not human and seemed like it was amped or mic'd up because it seemed so powerful. Not that it was a loud growl, but it seemed unnatural. Also, the height it seemed to emanate from and the silence that preceded it led me to the conclusion. My husband agrees, because the entire week he too has been on edge. We have lived here for a year and all seemed normal until this very week. Our cat, which is an indoor cat, got out accidentally and has vanished, without a trace, mind you. She has gotten out before and just stood around until we got her back in the house. Also, my husband said that Tuesday night he experienced the same silence outside, and it really unnerved him too. He says he has never experienced anything so eerie. On Wednesday, he took our dog up into the woods to look for our cat and felt very uneasy. He said the dog kept tucking its tail and turning around, wanting to go home. It's not like our dog or even my husband to feel uneasy in the woods, because both of them love the outdoors and are very comfortable in nature. On Thursday, at dusk, he took the dog around the back lot and says something took off from the thicket at a sprint and came crashing through the woods down the hill towards him. He always carries a sidearm when he is out and is normally not really afraid of anything, but he actually turned and ran back up towards the house. Whatever was charging stopped seconds after he stopped to listen and did not make another sound. He was very concerned when he came in, stating that he knows what big game sounds like, and that this was just not right. Even he was surprised that he ran from the sound. The following day was when my encounter happened. After talking about all these events with my husband, we are concerned that there is a dogman in the area. My husband had listened to episodes 90 and 91 of Dogman Encounters with Vic Hundiff and is so worried that this thing has decided to stalk one or both of our children. My husband said that based on those episodes, it sounds like the Dogman plans ahead when snatching kids, and he thinks it may have been scouting the area, with plans to do just that. He said it was doing that, or that it was waiting for me to leave one of the kids in the Jeep for just a minute. Either way, none of this is good. The main reason why I wanted to submit this to you was because it seems very unique in that it spoke to me. It wasn't the words, but the feeling it gave me that disturbed me the most. It was as if it was trying to give me the impression that I was nothing and that I was weak and just food. I got the impression that it was saying, "Can't get in. Haha, you're mine." It's tough to explain because it seemed like it was conveying its frame of mind, and that was, for lack of a better description, mocking me in a very cruel way. I really want to know if you have ever heard of one of these monsters actually speaking. My husband and I really want to believe that our conclusions are wrong, but instinct and other encounters have highly convinced us that it in fact was a Dogman. Story 3. A park ranger, John Irwin, was traveling through a deserted road within the forest and had reached a spot where the Mullica River, next to the road, went up ahead. His headlights shone on a large dark figure that was emerging from the woods and was moving into the roadway. As he got closer, the figure stood in front of the car, blocking the roadway. Irwin had to stop his car in order to avoid hitting the creature. The creature was described as being well over 6 foot tall and covered with black fur that looked wet and matted. It appeared not to have any forelegs, but had a pair of huge, powerful hind legs. The creature glanced through the windshield of the car, revealing 2 piercing red eyes. It stood a few moments and then turned and continued across the road, walking upright like a human in a peculiar robot-like fashion. Story 4. June 1st, 2017. I was going through the hiking trails with my dog behind my town's local high school, fairly late one night. I had gone there plenty of times before since I was young, so I wasn't frightened. While I was walking my dog, he kept trying to stop and was whimpering, which was strange because he is normally a very brave dog. After walking for about 10 minutes longer, I heard huge branches crashing and breaking. That's when I started to become frightened and decided to turn back. While walking back, I could tell that something was following me. I was terrified. Suddenly, after a minute of calmness, this creature leaped in front of me across the trail. The creature had long, dark fur and was enormous. It wasn't a bear. It was like a very muscular, huge wolf. After seeing this, I picked up my dog and sprinted off the trail without ever seeing it again. That was easily one of the most terrifying nights of my life. Story 5. Since it was summer break for my school, I was lazily lounging at home, watching TV. I got bored, so I went outside to see if I could do anything with my chickens, like feed them worms and snails. Before I go into more detail, I should explain the area I live in. My home is on the outskirts of the city I live in. I had about 5 or 7 chickens at the time, and we hadn't expanded the coop yet, so it was a small pen connecting to 2 sides of the chicken coop, which is wooden and sturdy. The only ways to get into the coop is either through the trap door attached to the big door and the 3 windows. One window is on one side of the door, and the second window is on the other side. The third window is a large window. Keep in mind that they all have traps connected to them so they can be closed. We have 7 acres of woodland that we call the back pasture, and if you've ever been back there, you could see that it's a popular habitat for the local deer. There was also a wild boar that was roaming around at the time, and I don't know how it got there. We had been having troubles with poachers for a while, considering the population of deer in the woods. One poacher had set up a trail cam, one that was motion activated. There was an old rusty deer stand that had been put on a tree a long time ago, and the tree had begun to grow around it. Beyond our acres of woods, there's a large cornfield owned by our neighbors, and beyond that is a forest. I don't know what the forest is like beyond that field, since we've never been there. I went outside to do something with my chickens, and had brought along a bucket of corn for feeding the deer afterwards. When I walked out of my house, I saw a doe was sitting in the tall grass. I thought thought it was sleeping since its head was down and it wasn't moving. I, being the curious little nut that I was, decided that I would sneak up on the deer and get a picture of it to show my mother when she got home from work. I crept as silently as I could across that yard that separated me from the deer. I should also mention that we have a clearing with a burn pit in it that was filled with cedar branches. I was creeping across my yard towards the deer, and when I had cleared the burn pit and was about 10 yards from it, I realized that the deer wasn't asleep, but it was dead. It was the most disgusting sight I had ever seen. Its intestines were completely gone, the flesh on the body of the doe shredded to pieces, and blood everywhere. It looked as if it had been sitting there for a while, and smelt like it too. Most of the blood was dried, and the air reeked with the stench of rotting flesh, urine, and what seemed to be like a hint of wet dog. Something that creeped me out about the scene was, although it was a rotting carcass, there were no insects at all around it. It was as if the usual lively forest was deader than the deer. Not even the neighbor's cattle made a sound. It looked as if the poor deer had simply been left after being brutally attacked and half-eaten, which it most likely was. I left the bucket at the beginning of the trail, thinking that I would come out later with my mother and grain the deer when she got home. Then I started to walk back to my house. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard a low, snarling growl that sounded like a wolf, although it seemed distorted as if it were being played on an old radio. Against my better judgment, I turned my head around and I saw what looked like the biggest freaking wolf I'd ever seen. It was on all fours. Its fur was black and matted in places. Its face was what you'd expect a wolf to look like, although it was broad and the muzzle seemed a little short. Although the way it was curling its lips made it look as if the snout was plenty long, and its eyes were yellow. Not a bright yellow, like the yellow of a flower or the sun, but a dim, deep, amber red yellow, if that makes sense. Its ears looked like that of a Doberman pinscher, with a cropped effect going on. Its front legs were long, and it looked as if it were a bodybuilder. Its paws, if you can even call them paws, looked like huge hands with long claws at the end of them. It stood up, and I heard the most sickening popping sound you could ever imagine. It sounded like the sound of popping joints, but it seemed amplified as if it were being played through a microphone. Its body looked like a bodybuilder's pumped up on steroids. It was so big. It had no tail that I could tell, and it seemed to tower over me, although I was a good 10 meters from it. I was about 5 foot 4 inches at the time, and I came nowhere close to its height. It was so tall that the tip of its ears could almost touch the top of a young cedar. It let out a very loud howl, which sounded more like a roar, and it charged me. Doing the only thing I knew to do while hyped up on fear and adrenaline, I began to run away. I remember clearing my yard in what seemed like hours, but was most likely only a few seconds, and running inside, slamming and locking all the doors and windows. As I calmed down a small bit, I had realized that if it had really wanted to kill me, that it would have, and that what I experienced was not an attack, but a bluff charge, very common for many predators in the wild. I was lucky to get away with my life. Although this happened almost 2 years ago, it still terrifies me to think about it. The deer was gone the next day, and ever since that evening I have been weary around those woods, only going in them in broad daylight, only when I absolutely had to, and never without a weapon. Sadly, I cannot say that I am one of those people that have stopped experiencing things after the encounter, although I only had nightmares for a month after that day in June. Nothing really started to happen again until about 2 months ago when I was staying up at night playing on the laptop. I had started to hear things moving around on the porch and turned on the light to see the shape of something huge disappearing behind the corner of my house. There was also one of the rare times I went into the woods after the first encounter when I was helping my mother clear brush from the hunting clearing. I was going to get the mower and was walking the trail to do so when I heard bipedal footsteps following me off to my side. They stopped wherever I stopped, and I eventually ran out of the woods and have never been back since. I asked my late grandmother about the creature I had seen, and she informed me that there was something called the Wolfhead Man that stalked the Kansa tribe, preying on small children that strayed too far from their tents. Later, I was informed by my history teacher that my house had actually been built on a tribal burial ground, and I have since been wondering if that had anything to do with it. I hadn't heard about the Wolfhead Man before she told me about it. When I saw that there were several eyewitness reports that were proved to be truthful, it made me feel a lot better about coming out with this information. I had attempted to tell people previously to this, but everyone either said I was stupid, crazy, or just a liar. One thing's for certain, I am not stupid. I am not crazy, and I am most definitely not a liar. I know what I saw, and what I saw is a Dogman. Story 6. I'm reporting a possible Dogman sighting, based on the info provided by my son and his friend. This occurred in Montgomery, Massachusetts. As a four-wheel enthusiast, my older son has become familiar with off-roading trails and rural routes that he and his friends use regularly, often at nighttime. On this occasion, they were in his Ford Explorer, following a familiar route in a rural town through a remote wooded area. Being winter, the plow stopped at a certain point, leaving a bank of snow at that point, marking where the town abandoned maintenance of that unpaved road for the winter, leaving further use of this road to those who dare. As my son related, he four-wheeled through the snowbank and drove along the rain road, which winded a mountain. He concentrated on his driving, focusing on the road, as his close friend sat in the front passenger seat. Suddenly, his friend exclaimed, "Look, what is that?" My son didn't lift up his eyes to see it because he wanted to stay on the road. His buddy pointed to where it went. So, my son quickly swung his truck around and illuminated the area with his off-road lights and headlights. His friend described what he saw as running like a wolf, but not a wolf. He said it was big like a bear, but not a bear. He also said it had long hair and was lighter in color than a brown bear. He said it was gray in color. They sat there for a minute or so, staring into the darkness. Suddenly, something pushed the SUV from behind, making it slide along the muddy, snowy road just a short distance. They both whipped their heads around, only to see the blackness of night out of the rear window. Then he quickly started the truck and sped out of there, not seeing the creature again. My son stated that it could not have been the same creature his buddy spotted, because once he had illuminated the area with the truck's lights, they would have spotted movement against the white snow. Another one of my friends insisted this was a Bigfoot, as he had an encounter years ago, but this description seems to better fit a Dogman. This experience, whatever it was, is absolutely true. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I'm working on releasing videos daily, and I will keep covering a wide range of topics, from gargoyles to creepy camping stories to Dogman and much, much more. Keep your eyes and ears peeled, and stay afraid for what lurks in the darkness around you. Tonight, we finally begin our series on United States Southern Dogman and werewolf encounters. This episode takes us through 7 frightening encounters from Tennessee, as well as North Carolina and more. So sit back and enjoy the scare. 2002. I'm a 32-year-old female from the very northern tip of West Virginia. Most of my life has been lived in Hancock County. When I was little, we camped in tents, walked everywhere, hiked at parks, all that outside goodness. In my teens, we started going to state parks to ride horses. I've been to Tumblesome Run, Beaver Creek, State Park, Salt Fork, Raccoon Creek, and Vista Park, and I think that was the name. We had a friend who was constantly inviting us to ride on people's land she had received permission from. I'm well acquainted with the local wildlife. I've seen all the major players, including coy dogs and bears, and I can identify most sounds in the forest. I love watching nature documentaries. I was looking to become a vet, so I studied a lot. Drawing and painting them got me very acquainted with animal anatomy. Was I ever into cryptozoology? Yes, I was a dino-crazy little girl. My one babysitter had Reader's Digest Mysteries of the Unexplained. The thought of a plesiosaur in Scotland or an apatosaur in the Congo was just mind-blowing. Later in life, I started looking at it like folklore. It was interesting to read the accounts and learn the theories behind what people were seeing, but I believed in them as much as a folklorist believes in dragons and trolls. I didn't have any interest in Bigfoot, and I never heard of Dogman. I never had interest in looking, nor did the thoughts ever cross my mind. It did seem to me, though, that it seems I didn't need to go looking there. They found me. We moved to the farm when I was about 10. Mom's dream was to have horses, and she was finally able to live it. The farmhouse was haunted, mainly by the former residents of the house. I never felt threatened by them, though. It's a little unnerving to have two men talking and moving the couch you're sitting on. Or should I say, it sounded like it. No one was home, no media was on, and yet I was hearing two men talking about how they were going to move the couch, and where, and the sound of the furniture being dragged right under me. The land itself had its share of strangeness. Most things were benign, though. We just shrugged and carried on. I honestly hated our woods. Anywhere else, I'd flee or hike, but even in the yard, sometimes I felt watched. Hell, sometimes I thought something was staring in our windows. Now that I think of it, we did have things slam into our trailer. I think it was a horse that had gotten loose, but when I'd go out to investigate, I wouldn't find a thing. I'd chalk it up to a deer. I used my horses' breeds for their names rather than think up names for them. Anyone who knows me knew my horses' names. I was 18 and 19 in this particular encounter, and by this time, we gave up on cows. I hate cows, and just had horses and chickens. Someone knocked at the door, and it was at 2 a.m. I'd only been asleep for 2 hours, but years of conditioning had my heart pumping and my mind clearing. Someone knocking that early meant trouble. It usually meant horses or livestock had gotten out. I wasn't disappointed. Our neighbor said the horses were in his yard. My mind wasn't totally awake, so I didn't think to ask which yard they were in. My stepfather came out, asked what was up, and told me they were my horses, so deal with it. Mom was working at the time, and that was nothing new. This lot of horses had 3 expert escape artists. I had the routine down. It was pretty dark out, but I did have some moonlight to help. The security light only went so far. Then, of course, it shut off after so long. When it was cloudy, you could literally have to watch that you didn't walk off into the ravine. It was so pitch black. I was naturally in a foul mood, cursing my horses, and wondering if some drunk had gone through the fence again. It happened a lot, believe it or not. As I got closer to the brown barn, I realized a horse was flipping out. It was running back and forth, squealing and carrying on. I went in and grabbed the halters and leads, and paused for a moment to see if there was any other horse, or horses had replied to the horse I heard squeal. That would give me an idea where the other horse or horses might be. There was no reply. That was odd. I was thinking, crap, they're on the other side of the hill. It was the only reason in my mind they wouldn't be replying. Let's just say when they followed our cut trails to the other side, it took us an hour to traverse the woods and lead them back. And even with 2 guys on a 4-wheeler and my mom, that was a freaky trek. I felt like I was being watched and followed. Maybe it wasn't paranoia. So the land is set up like this. The brown barn was connected to a small pasture, about half an acre long, which then connects to a 7-acre pasture. Pretty much in the center, on the outside edge of a large pasture, was an old white barn that we turned into a run-in. I decided to tackle the horse still in the fence, so I can bring her down to the small pasture, just to keep her from escaping too. Maybe the others would follow. I had to walk clear to the other side of the pasture to get to the panicking horse. It was my mother's Psycho horse. I tried to catch her and nearly got trampled a few times trying. She was frothing at the mouth, and her eyes white were really showing. Was I alarmed? No. As I said, Psycho. I noticed my other 6 were across the road. They were standing in a tiny, little fenced-in area under a spotlight. They were standing motionless and not touching a blade of grass. I was wondering how the neighbor managed to herd them into that tiny fenced-in area with that tiny door. 3 of those horses were over 16 hands tall. One was a draft horse cross. The doorway was actually small enough. He touched both sides, going through. My thoroughbred mare took me 2 hours to corral, and the last time she got out, much to my frustration, was an awesome jumper. So, a stranger rounding them up and putting them into a tiny yard was mind-blowing. I've had horses since I was 9. I'm 32 now. I've had ponies and horses. I've had a couple of different Arabians, draft horses, quarter horses, walking horses, saddlebreds, and other thoroughbreds and Mustangs, and all different kinds. I've had a lot of horses from all walks of life. I will tell you, they consistently do not like to be crammed into tight spaces, no matter what breed it is, especially not in a group. They were just silent and dead still. My neighbor came out and told me that they were like that when he found them. He asked me if I needed any help, but I told him no. My thoroughbred and racking horse mares did not like men. I told him I'd take them out one at a time. I took one halter and lead and threw the rest outside the gate. I put the halter on my gelding and opened the gate to lead them out. They had other plans, though. All 6 came out as a freaking unit. They were literally chest to butt crammed together. My gelding and my Welsh mare had their chests pushing against me as we walked back to the brown barn. Normally, they did not do this. I wouldn't usually allow such a bad behavior. We were on the main road, which I did not like. The speed limit is only 35, but people go 60 all the time. So I tried to lead them through the large pasture gate. They wouldn't even go on that side of the road, though. I was a little unnerved by their strange behavior. So I led them down to the brown barn, and they went in. They were skittish at first, though, picking at the hay I threw out, walking around relentlessly, sticking to the barn like glue, and eyeing the upper pasture. I rationalized it by thinking, it's the Appy flipping out that's unnerving them, and why hadn't she come down yet? She had to have seen us all walk down. I rushed to the gate between the little and big pastures out of habit. I didn't want the herd to go back out into the big pasture. I didn't have to worry. They didn't follow me like they usually did. The gate was wide open, but the Appy was still running and squealing back and forth in the same area. I started to go get her. Now, the neighbor's security lights didn't really light up my pasture. The road was higher than my pasture, so it was cast in a shadow. I can make out her shape in some detail, though. She took off at a panicked gallop, swerved sideways, and jumped the stream. When she landed, she nearly landed on her face. She caught herself through and took off at a dead gallop again. I ducked behind a stump. If she would have hit me, I would have been dead. I went back and chained the gate. I decided to forego licking her over until I got the halters and leads. She was too hot at the moment. I decided to walk on the road instead of the pasture again. The pasture wasn't even, unlit, and full of springs. Sometime, though, during this, clouds had taken over the sky, so there was no moonlight to be seen. The spot on the road, though, where I was at, was paved and pretty well lit, though my neighbor was paranoid. I had almost gotten to the white barn when I got this sudden urge to stop and look at a very specific spot in the pasture. I would like to say it was instinct that told me to look, but usually I'd scan the woods first to see what was watching me. That's usually where the watchers are. Instead, I just flicked on my flashlight right on a certain spot. It was extremely close to where the mare was flipping out. I saw red eye shine. My first thought was, why in the world would a deer be there with all that chaos? I was feeling a sense of extreme dread and didn't know why. Besides, it being where my horse was going nuts told me something else just wasn't right. I then realized where the eyes were relative to the walnut trees and my racing barrels. See, the road is above the pasture and the walnut trees were right at the same elevation as the road. The pasture itself is sloped to deal with the runoff from the road. The barrel it was next to was on the low end of the incline. The barrels were white, so I could see a dim lighting from my flashlight on one of it was next to. This thing was too freaking big to be a deer. I was frozen standing there, watching it. I just had this feeling it was evil, and then I had to keep track of those eyes. It was watching me. It slowly blinked a few times. It also looked over into the woods, above the pasture. I know you ask your guests if they ever feel there are other ones out there. Well, let me tell you, it crossed my mind. With a sinking stomach, I flashed my flashlight over the woods to see if I would catch eyeshine. I didn't see any though, so I went right back to the eyes. They were still there. I flicked back and forth, making sure nothing was sneaking up on me. I don't know how long I stood there, watching frozen. Someone could have come around the bend and hit me with their car. I was so focused. Finally, it started to move off. It glanced at me sideways a few times. I think it went into the copse of trees around the creek. I heard nothing. That wasn't surprising though. The horses were still restless and making noise. I stood there a long time after looking for the eyeshine. I was wondering if it could have been a bear. I don't think so though. The eyes were consistent in height until it disappeared. Bears are clumsy on their back legs. On this uneven inclined ground, I have no doubt a bear would have dropped to the ground to go on all fours. Even the rear up and down behavior bears do when they're trying to see something wouldn't work. We had one cross the pasture before, and he made a lot of noise going through the woods. The horses settled down quicker with the bear. I was almost to my neighbors at this point, and I considered leaving a couple $100 of tack at his house. I had no doubt if I left them there, they'd be gone in the morning, and my mom would be pissed. So I darted over, grabbed them, and ran like a bat out of hell. I should have left the tack. I know, you're not supposed to run, but I couldn't even conceive what I had just seen. I got into the barn, threw the tack down, and hung with the horses. I wasn't going to go back up that pitch-black driveway on foot. I figured with the horses, I'd have a warning, and the barn had plenty of sharp things. I didn't go back up until dawn. I was frozen stiff by that time. I've had years to think this over. It unnerves me that whatever it was watching me for however long. How long was that thing there? Was that what was keeping Appy Mare from coming down? Was it right there in the shadows while I was trying to catch her? Or was it in the unlit barn I walked through to get to the road? Was it the reason Appy swerved and nearly fell? How did my horses get out? I never did find out how they got out. Did they panic and jump? I did check the fence line away from the woods, and I did look for other tracks around the barrel. Sadly, the ground was hard from frost in the morning, but I will say the Appy Mare was running for a good while, and the ground was severely torn up and turned into a muddy mess. I'll bet it was her that woke the neighbor up. To this day, I'm not quite sure what it was that I felt and experienced. I just hope that it never comes back around my horses ever again. Date unknown. My stepdad lived in Virginia when he was around the age of 8, right at the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp. According to him, he was in bed one night when the sky was cloudless or just very bright. He never thought until recently whether the moon was shining or not, and saw a beast looking right at him through his window. He said he could see spittle running down its face, and its eyes were looking straight at him. It was supposedly standing on its hind legs and had cream, red, and brown colored matted fur and a face almost like a wolf. Other than its snout, its facial features were very human. Its jawbones were high, and the structure around its eyes and its eyes themselves were human-esque. The coloring of its eyes, he believes, were yellow. The reason why I think this is interesting and possibly valid is because the Great Dismal Swamp covers a huge amount of territory and is hardly touched by humans. Only in recent years have people started to study its inhabitants. The grounds are wet, mossy, and absorb sound quite well. People have been known to wander into it and never return. Who knows what could be lurking in the unknown? Just chills my bones to think about. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that he crawled out of his bed and went straight to his mother's room. In the morning, when they looked around the house, all the windows had ground that was stirred up under them, and the grass was yanked out. There were actual scratches in the wood under his window, and paint was missing too. However, as far as they could see, there were no discernible footprints. Story 3. Date unknown. Just thought I would report this as a potential Dogman hearing, not a sighting. Multiple coworkers of mine in Shelby County, Tennessee, medical facility, have heard a strange creature screaming and making crystal clear sounds behind the facility. It is well lit, fenced, but there are woods behind, and also a river bottom near. 3 separate people have heard the noise, 2 together, one at an earlier time last summer. This most recent event happened within the last month. When discussing it, the third person confidently says that they had also heard the noise in the pre-dawn house while getting something from their vehicle and couldn't believe it, so they had never mentioned it to anyone. After hearing the details of what the other 2 heard, the third person confided. All 3 are medical professionals, have outdoor experience and cannot identify the creature making the sounds. They described it as being loud, crystal clear, and even though it was from an obvious distance, the call was loud enough to be heard clearly from within a running car with defroster blowing. This occurred at twilight, roughly 6 to 7 a.m. Also, since this occurred near shift change, there were several ladies coming into work who obviously heard the noise too and rushed inside the building, as observed by the 2 who were leaving. Story 4. Date unknown. Laugh at me. I really don't care. I don't know what I saw, but it looked like a cross between a guy and a wolf. I shit you not. I was on my way home from work. I was maybe 10 minutes away from the house, coming up a big hill. I suddenly got the strangest feeling. So I slowed down, thinking a deer was going to come out of the woods or something. I just felt like I was being watched or followed. There were no cars in front of me or behind me. I got to the top of the hill and slammed on my brakes because as soon as I got to the top of the hill, this huge, black, hairy thing came bounding across the road. It was so big that when it ran, its back arched up, kind of like a cheetah, but only a lot more than that. I knew that if it would have stood up, it would have been well over 6 feet tall, maybe even taller. I also know another car saw it too, because when I hit the brakes, another car turned onto that road and slammed onto their brakes too. We both just sat there for a few minutes, which was not really safe considering it, I know, but we were in shock. I truly have no idea what it was that I saw. It was not a dog or a horse. Dogs do not get that big or arch their backs like this thing did when it was running. The arms and legs, whatever it had, were so long, it was having to throw them out to the side. Think kind of like a crab walk, just to run. And the appendages it had were just as big as it was. It ran from one side of the woods to the other, non-stop, like it was either going after something or running away from something. I honestly have no idea what the holy freaking hell it was that I saw, and I don't care if you laugh at me. I know what I saw. Story 5. 2012. I'd like to tell you about the encounter my son had, maybe 4 years ago. He had told me about it then, but I had no clue. Now we have Dogman encounters, and now I know. Here's what happened. My son's friend was driving him home about 11 p.m. through a rural residential area. The houses are spaced some distance apart. They were on a 2-lane highway with no streetlights and very little traffic. The area is not overly wooded, but has patches of trees and fields. This area would probably be included in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. Anyway, they were driving along when suddenly, from the right side of the road, this thing sprang out and was across the road and into the bushes on the other side in just 2 leaps or bounds, or steps, or however you want to say it. It was in full view because of their headlights. My son said the first thing he thought was dog. He went on to say that it was running on all fours like a deer. He said it was the cooler version of a deer with a huge dog head, massive shoulders, and a really small waist. He kept repeating just how big it was, so I asked for a comparison. I asked if he meant huge like maybe big deer, or was it maybe as tall as a cow? He answered and can quote his answer. "Mom, this thing was massive. If we had hit it, the car would have gone underneath it and its body would have hit the windshield." I don't remember what kind of car it was, but it was about the size and shape of one of those older Sentras. He said that neither he or his friend said anything for about 10 seconds, and then his friend yelled, "Did you see that?" My son said yes, and they didn't say another word the rest of the way. And that's it. It's really creepy to me, and I thought other listeners might like to hear about it. Story 6. July 1990. I was around 9 years old or so and was at my mom's friend's house because they were having a little get-together. My mom's best friend at the time decided to go get something, which was at a house nearby down a dirt road in the woods. My mom's friend decided to take me and friend with her. I wish I had never gone with her. We rode out with her over there, and when she got out, my friend and I stayed in her car and waited for her to come back. After sitting in her car for 10 minutes, we decided to get out to see what was taking her so long. When we did that, she told us to get back in the car, so we did. As it turned out, she was buying weed, so we weren't welcome in the house. So my buddy and I got back in her car and waited for her to come out. They had a lot of bulldogs on that property. The dogs had all been barking like crazy and then just stopped all at once and went to their dog houses. That's when my friend and I saw this thing that looked like some kind of werewolf coming from behind the car. We froze and just stared at it as it walked by. Wow! It looked so evil and demonic. When we saw it, we ducked down and laid on the floorboards. And we lay there for what seemed like forever, until we heard my mom's friend hitting on the driver's window, trying to get us to let her in. I guess it left when it heard her come out of the house or something. Who knows, maybe it was lurking around the area, just waiting for the right time. Story 7. On the night I had my brief encounter, it was unusually slow. During slow parts of my night, I park outside the facility I work out of and watch the wildlife. It's abundant, with a mixture of fox, coyotes, raccoons, and every once in a while, I'll spy a red wolf breaking the woodline, trotting across an open field in search of small game. Our facility is located on a dead-end street, which backs up to a major creek, and to the left, we have a smaller creek that breaks off to the larger one. Both creeks are fed by a large river about a mile away. I should also mention that we have large patches of woodland that lead to our facility, that the area does not have a lot of light until you turn into the parking lot. About a week prior to my encounter, I would sit at the end of the road to complete my paperwork and wait for the next call to come. As I parked there, I would get a sense of being watched. I would look up, almost expecting someone to be standing in front of my truck. Let me say that darkness or the woods does not spook me in the slightest, or even make me jumpy. I was raised in the swamp, close to a river, and rather enjoy the solitude. Not only did I have a sense of being watched and sharing my space with someone, I noted that there were no normal night sounds, such as crickets and frogs and what have you. I also found it baffling that all the wildlife seemed to be gone from the area. This really bothered me, and I couldn't figure it out. On the night I had my encounter, I decided to leave some wet dog food at the edge of the woodline, hoping to entice a family of raccoons out, so I could at least see that they were okay. This family of raccoons I had watched grow up from kits, and not seeing them bothered me. Also, I didn't see a gray fox that would hang around that area. This fox would come within 4 to 5 feet from you, but would be guarded all the while. He would hang out with certain people and then retreat back into the woods. Anyway, I popped the top off some smelly dog food, and as I was pulling the top of the can, I heard a deep growl come from out of the edge of the woodline. I had never heard an animal growl with such force and so deeply. At first, I thought it could have been a jake brake from the interstate. That can be heard from our facility, but that's not what it was. I could hear it from the woodline, hitting my face, and felt the growl inside of my chest, pretty much like a vibration. I knew this wasn't a bear, the same as someone knows their left hand from their right. You just know. And yes, we do have bear here, but I can tell you quite bluntly and very firmly, this was not a bear or any other wildlife that was normal to the area. I dropped my head down and refused to look up. I dumped the can of food on the ground with one hard thump, hoping whatever it was in the woodline would rather have the can of food instead of me. I backed away from the food with my head down until I reached my truck. My instinct told me to drive away, and so I did. About a half an hour later, I returned, and due to my curiosity overruling my common sense. Being a natural skeptic, I was prepared to figure out the earlier event. I parked in the same place, and this time had walked to the back of my truck to smoke. While standing there, I observed a dark mass come across the road and disappear into an open field that is mostly overgrown with wild blackberry bushes and grass. I have a trained eye. I take in a lot of detail, and still, I had to admit suffering from short-term memory loss due to a TBI that ended my law enforcement career. What I saw at that moment, though, will be in my memory forever. I can only describe this creature as what I took at the time to be some kind of hybrid. Although it was on all fours, to me, it did not appear natural by any means. It moved with very quick, fluent motions. Looking back, I was most surprised by the creature having the intelligence to attempt to appear natural. Something was off with its gait, though. It was kind of like the front legs were pulling its body forward. The back was hunched at the shoulders, and it had a long back. The creature itself was black, which I can only describe as a dark mass, with really no reflection. I also noted it had a small animal in its mouth. The strange part was that I could see the definition of most of the small animal compared to the darkness of the creature that I now believe to be a Dogman. The snout was long, but fit its body. What struck me most were its ears. They were folded back like you might see on a Dutch Shepherd or even a German Shepherd. I guess with my background, working with dogs, the ears were clearly defined to me. I can't say what kind of tail it had or what color its eyes were. I just know it was there 1 minute and gone the next. When daylight came, I looked for tracks, but listened to my gut and did not enter that field looking for it. The ground leading out of the smaller creek was covered in grass, and what dirt was there was hard. I was left baffled, but more amazed than anything. I sat on my experience for several months. I didn't tell anyone about it. I then started searching the internet for what I had seen. I guess, in my mind, I wondered if it was some type of hybrid creature created by man and had somehow escaped. I found several sites on the internet, but none seemed to come close to what I had seen. Nothing until I came across a picture of a supposed Dogman. If you take what I saw and stand it upright, instead of being on all fours, that's what I saw. Without a doubt, I'm pretty sure this Dogman was a young adult, but it wasn't overly massive. What I ponder the most is the fact that the Dogman had to catch my scent before killing out the woodline. I know scent. I know how it works. The Dogman knew I was there before coming out of the woods. I suppose that will be the answer I will never have. After a few months of just keeping my experience to myself, I spoke with a few of my coworkers. Of course, they told me it was a bear or a large wolf, but they did acknowledge that the wildlife had disappeared for a while. I was told to share my story, but I think it was only so my coworkers could get a good laugh at me behind my back. I stand by what I saw, although I don't speak about it much because of people like him. As I write this, I'm once again on the night shift, parked at the same spot where I had my encounter. I'm pretty sure that Dogman has left the area. Wildlife is back and the night sounds are all around. I guess I will always wonder if it will come back again. but I can't say I will ever walk in the woods at night again by myself looking for animal tracks. Thanks for watching this video. If you like my content, subscribe and be sure to leave a comment. Stay tuned, since we're going to start having a lot of really cool stories come down the pipeline. Not only just Werewolf and Dogman, but stories no one has ever heard of or has ever been released, period. I got the dirt that people